and say their Social Security money came into the bank account. Well, don't spend that money because the government will take it back after they die. Be prepared for that. They may not take back the whole amount, but they will look at the date of death and calculate what they call a clawback. And if it's not there, they're going to come after you to pay it back. Hello, everybody. Nancy Cogar here. Welcome to Boomer Time. I'm glad you're here. We've talked a lot about estate administration and probate. One of the things we haven't talked about is paying those claims, right? Someone else's bills. Bills. A lot of people don't like paying their own bills, but what about other bills, other people's bills? If your loved one dies, what are you responsible for? And what are you not responsible for? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. And that can cause a lot of heartache. And sometimes when you don't know your rights, you pay for things that you don't have to pay for with your own money. So listen up. We're going to talk about that and a lot of other things today. So dealing with a loved one's bills after they pass, like I said, is complex and it can be emotionally draining. That's the kind of thing that can cause fights in the family, right? Especially at the funeral home. Well, here's some general steps I wanted to talk about after someone passes away. What are the first things you should do about getting things in order, making sure you know what's owed, what's active, what's not, and what's considered something you have to pay versus something you don't? Well, I would say the first thing that you should do after you've taken care of your loved one's memorial service and so forth is obtain a death certificate. In other words, that's just like a birth certificate, right? It's a certified document that shows the date of death and that the person is deceased. You will need multiple copies of this, so make sure that you get at least 4. You may need more if you're doing probate administration. And you can always go back and get them, but they do charge you for that. So you are going to need that death certificate, though, to handle financial matters, including making claims for life insurance policies and for dealing with bills. That's one of the first things they ask. Send us a death certificate. You can get these from the funeral home. That's where you get them. Or you can request them from the state of Tennessee or the county where you live. Usually they'll send you right to the state website, tn.gov. Notify creditors. That's the second thing I would say. Inform the companies or the institutions where your deceased loved one had bills. And these can be all kinds of different bills, like credit cards, right? Utility services, mortgages, car loans, other kinds of service providers. This will stop them, hopefully, from charging further fees, but it doesn't release the obligation. And I want to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But you may need to provide that death certificate and also proof that you're handling their affairs. What do I mean by that? I mean, if there was a will that you're named as executor, and they're going to ask you, I can guarantee you, they'll ask you for something called letters testamentary. And you get those from the court. So if you have a will, you're going to have to start a probate, and you may not even be able to deal with the bills until after you get letters testamentary. That means that oftentimes, you will have to pay some of those bills, especially mortgage bills, things like that, to keep them current, because the bank is not going to stop a foreclosure or a default on a loan just because someone passed away. Sorry to say that, but that's true. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but we are talking about, the first things you need to do when your loved one dies. I noticed this a couple minutes ago, but I would say check for a will. If your loved one had one, It will outline how their assets and their debts are to be handled. If they didn't have a will, then you got to rely back on state law, right? How the estate is distributed. As I said, if you're the executor, you're going to have the legal authority to manage the estate. It's really kind of a thankless job in a lot of ways, though. You have to make sure that all the claims are, there's notice to creditors that you are paying debts with the court's approval. You've done that and you have the money to pay those. As I've said, there is a statute that allows you to pay things in advance up to 4 months. But after that, if you don't have a probate started, you're gonna run into some trouble. And that's not always possible. Probate is essentially created to handle the debts that a loved one leaves behind when they die. So first thing, even before you go to court, I would try to identify what are those debts? What are their bills, right? What assets do they have? Because that is what you're going to use to pay the debts that you have to pay. And all that comes before you or anybody else in the family gets a distribution. That's important. Let me say that again. You have to settle the debts and claims before the distributions get made. And some of these creditors have interesting priorities, I would say. Obviously the IRS would have a priority if there was a past due tax. But what about TennCare, Medicare? I've talked about that before. I mean, Medicaid, I should say. I've talked about that before. They have a super priority in probate to go after debts for claims that were paid while the person was alive. So either for home care or for nursing home care. So that, TennCare, they are responsible. They actually have a mandate. They must recover against claims for benefits that were paid during someone's lifetime. So if you're in probate, you have to get a letter releasing the estate from TennCare Recovery. That's just part of it. And if you've got a claim, you got to deal with it. And it's one of the biggest. Hey, guess what the other big is? Funeral expenses. That makes sense, doesn't it? Priority claim, being able to, administer your loved one's memorial service. And what do you do with the body, right? Maybe you've got a family plot. Maybe you don't. Maybe they had prepaid funeral planning. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they wanted to be buried and maybe they didn't. What do you do? Well, that also is a very expensive proposition. Now, as I said, it is a priority claim that the court takes very seriously that can be reimbursed to you, but you're talking, anywhere from $3,000 to $10,000. So that's quite a bit of money. I want to talk a little bit too about what do you do if you don't have that money? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Before I do that, though, wanted to touch on the types of debts and finish that thought. They're credit cards, which are unsecured debts. But if you're on the credit cards with your loved one that passed away, guess who's on the hook? And that may be passed on to you. Quite frankly, it probably will be. Paying those bills, like I said, if there's enough assets in the estate, you can use those to pay outstanding bills. But sometimes there's more bills than assets. And that presents a problem as well. Creditors sometimes have to write all that debt off, but that's a process. This varies by jurisdiction, but I see it a lot. And it can cause some stress in families, believe me, because you're talking about money, right? There's money, there's bills, and what's left. Sometimes, like I said, sometimes there's nothing left. And that's difficult, especially if you've advanced money, right? Okay, well, that's just a little taste, but I'm going to talk about some more specifics when we come back. Stick with me. I get these kind of questions all the time. What do I need to pay when my loved one passes away? What don't I have to pay, right? Well, I'll give you my blanket answer. If you know something's due and you have the money to pay it in your loved one's estate, it should be paid. That makes sense, doesn't it? It's ethical, the right thing to do. But, when you do look at debts, there's certain debts, as I said before the break, that are considered priority debts, like a tax issue or 10 care. I mentioned them. And there's other debts that are secured debts, right? Secured means that there's some collateral attached to it, property attached to it that secures the amount that's owed. So that would be a mortgage. That would be a car, right? And you're going to have to pay those, or else you're going to get a call from the bank and you're going to see that repo man coming around and you're going to have to deal with that. And that's never fun. These are complex issues. They're kinds of things that I help people with all the time after a loved one dies. And I was going to say, it makes sense to contact an attorney if you're unsure about this process because, timing is really important with some of these issues, especially with notice and with filing claims, or if a credit card company files a claim. You can object to some of those, but you have to know why and for what and how. And that's what attorneys do. I do that all the time. I can guide you through that process in probate. But I do want to familiarize you with some of those things today, right? So, what's a special type of bill? Well, I don't see this one too often, but if your loved one had life insurance, that can help with some of the costs or paying off of debts. I think most of the time that life insurance policy would have to be payable to the estate of, because most of the time, if it's payable to one family member, what do? They file a claim and the check gets sent to them. So that's often what I see more than not. Social Security, you will want to notify the Social Security office and other pension providers, but I will tell you most of the time they know. And what I really wanted to tell you about that is if your loved one was on Social Security, which I'm sure they probably were most likely, right? And say their Social Security money came into the bank account. Well, don't spend that money because the government will take it back after they die. Be prepared for that. They may not take back the whole amount, but they will look at the date of death and calculate what they call a clawback. And if it's not there, they're going to come after you to pay it back. So, important to note, right? What about utilities and subscriptions? Well, call the cell phone company, call the magazine service, call Comcast. You can cancel all those things. Those are no longer needed. But utilities, lights, gas, water, you're going to have to keep those on. And you're also going to have to keep the house, if there is one, insured. Make sure to deal with that. Because this is how an attorney's brain works, okay? If you don't have insurance and say the house burns down, you can be liable for not keeping the house insured as the executor. Note to self, right? Keep records too. It's important to keep records of all these communications, especially the payments, right? Document all the payments that you're making on behalf of the decedent. And most of the time, we approach the court for reimbursement of some of those expenses that are advanced. As I said before, different types of debt have different priorities. Mention security, priority, funeral, final disposition of remains, tax debt, Medicaid, and, secured debts are secured by property, like I said, real estate, boats, cars. What isn't secured? I don't think I mentioned that before, and I wanted to make sure to do that. Well, that's unsecured debts are typically credit cards, right? But they're also medical debt. Did you know that if a loved one dies and there is no estate, you are not personally liable for your loved one's unsecured debts? That includes credit cards, it includes medical debt. Now, the creditor that's due won't tell you that, but it's important to know. Don't spend your money paying your loved one's unsecured debts. It's not your responsibility. It's the estate's responsibility. Okay? I wanted to say, related to that, you know, there's always a caveat, right? P.S. So if you're a co-signer, right? You're a joint account holder or something like that, then you may be legally obligated, right? Here's a breakdown. Debts you're typically not responsible for. Credit card, not jointly held. Um, Credit cards in their own name, if you're not a co-signer. Um, all those types of things. Like I said, those are the estate's responsibility. And you, as executor, are responsible for using the estate's money to pay off those debts, right? And that is before, as I said before, before any of the beneficiaries get any money. Okay? Well, here's an interesting question. What about student loans? We've heard so much about those back and forth in the news, haven't we? Well, if you're not a co-signer, that again is an estate issue. Okay, so if the deceased person had federal student loans, typically, unless there's a claim filed, those would be forgiven at death and not passed on to family members. There's always the exception if you have a private loan, but right now, that's what we see. I would say also, if you file bankruptcy, and an estate could file bankruptcy, student loans are not typically subject to a discharge. So you got to be careful of those things too. Like I said, the insurance can be a real issue, especially if the house is empty. So you'll want to make sure that the policy extends further. That's important, okay? And you want to put yourself, once you got the estate established, you want to put yourself as an additional loss payee. That means if something happens, you can file a claim. It's all these little nuances, they're little things, but they really add up to a minefield. I've said that before about estate planning, and it's true. The things you don't know can really hurt you. I saw a will today. I don't even know if it was a will, quite frankly. It was a do-it-yourself will. Remember, I've talked about those. Okay, so it said on the top that the person was making a will and then proceeded to say nothing else about anybody that was getting anything or anything that should be done following their death. I don't know how you could miss that, but this person did. So now we're looking at what is it and what do we do with it? So anyway, just a little aside there. I always see things, I love those stories. So what debts may you or are you responsible for? Take a look at that when we come right back. So we're talking bills after someone dies. What are you responsible for and what are you supposed to do if you're executor? And then what isn't your responsibility? Well, it kind of depends on your relationship with the deceased person. Let's say you're married, right? If you're married and it's a joint debt, then guess what? You're on the hook. Okay? Just because your spouse dies doesn't mean that the mortgage doesn't need to be paid. As a matter of fact, sometimes that is a real issue because spouses that have been married for a long time are used to the other person paying the mortgage bill, right? Maybe they're not familiar with doing that. If that's something you want to follow up on, I can tell you that because it gets behind and then it gets complicated. I did want to mention medical debt if you're married. So I said you're not responsible for a loved one's medical debt. Well, if you're married, in Tennessee at least, there's something that's known as the doctrine of necessities. What the heck is that, Nancy? Well, that essentially means that if you're married, you are responsible for your spouse's medical debt. So I just wanted to mention that's one of those exceptions again, right? Talk about those a lot. So I wanted to talk about funeral and burial costs because, as I indicated earlier in the show, they are expensive and, are typically paid by the estate. Maybe somebody had prepaid funeral planning. That is always a blessing. And if you're out there wondering, you're on the fence about whether you should do that or not, do it because you're doing your family a huge favor. Plus, you're guaranteeing that what you want is done. Because, like I said, funerals are expensive. So if you don't leave much in the estate, who is going to pay for these things? Well, have you ever seen those wild videos where people are just going at each other at the funerals? Unfortunately, I have. And, families are always remembering some issue or how someone did them bad, back in the day or whatever. But funeral expenses, especially if you pay those out of pocket, that could set you back $10,000, $15,000. Not everybody has $10,000, $15,000. So it begs the question, doesn't it? What happens if you don't have enough money to pay for the funeral? Add on to that, what happens if the loved one didn't take time to plan for their funeral? Well, this is a difficult one because I will tell you, I don't know. Sometimes, if someone's not willing or able to pay for it, it may not happen, right? What do you mean it may not happen? Well, I mean that you may have to call the state. You may have to call the county coroner. You may have to look at other ways to dispose of your loved one's remains. Even cremations are expensive. But do know that creditors can only pursue the estate of a deceased person to pay those kinds of debts. But problem is, if they don't have it, how are you going to get reimbursed if you're fronting the money? So that reminds me of another story that I wanted to share. I've got terrible stories, don't I? Well, I didn't think it was very common for people to leave their loved ones and not take care of the final remains and memorial service and so forth. Boy, was I wrong. So, and this is not funny, but it just surprising. So I had an occasion where I went to go to a hospital and I found out that the person that I was working with did not pick up their parents, or their mother more specifically, after she died. Actually, they just said they weren't that close. All right, about all the legal and ethical issues there, but so what happened to her? Well, the county coroner was called and they cremated her. And they set her up in a box up on a wall with literally dozens of other people that had not been picked up or recovered by their families. Yeah, pretty bad, but maybe that'll make you think about taking care of your estate planning and your business now versus later, right? I've got stories like you wouldn't believe. I got to share them all the time. But, creditors, either way, are, they have a limit as to how long they can attempt to recover a debt. And that just depends on the state they're in. So in an estate in Tennessee, they have a year as long as they've received notice. Once a year goes by, they're done. Statute of limitations bars them. Make it more complicated. After you establish probate, notice goes out. 4 months is the deadline. There's no easy answer in the law. So, like I said, it's always best to have some professional help. Okay? Finally, I wanted to let you know that your loved one's creditors cannot harass you. All right? There's something called the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, and they can't call you and harass you for your loved one's debt. File that one away, right? Well, this is important stuff, folks, and I hope you've got some good takeaways from today. It's, like I said, it's not an easy road, but stick with me here on Boomer Time, and we'll keep trucking down that road. I'll make you more educated and more aware. So as you age, you'll have a better life, right? You'll be more prepared, at least. I'll see you next time.